All right, good morning, Vaughn. End of another eventful week, as always, in BC politics.
Yeah, good
Um,
morning. There's kind of not undull on the national scene either. With what's been going on. Well, I talked to a colleague who said, she left Ottawa a long time ago. She kind of wishes she was back there. It's so exciting at the moment. So, yeah, it's
sure.
it's a very very lively time in politics, and south of the border, of course, it's as dull as all get out as well. It's an amazing time here.
So I guess we could tie those two things together. What does Trudeau's departure mean for BC, and how
Yeah,
can you
we
keep
had a
it up?
news conference with David Eby on Tuesday of this week. It's his first one of the new year. And, when somebody leaves office or says they're leaving, you try to say something nice. So the premier thanked the prime minister for his service, said that, he and the prime minister have had their differences, but they got a lot done too, working with Ottawa. All that was very nice. But when we got to the questions with David Eby, it was pretty clear that he thinks the prime minister is going at a bad time, is leaving the country in the lurch. And you could tell that just from his answers to some questions. So the premier said, with the prime minister going, the premiers of the country are going to have to take the lead in dealing with the Americans on the Donald Trump threat on tariffs. And as the news conference went on, David Eby listed a few other problems that have arisen because of the way Justin Trudeau left, putting the entire federal government and parliament on hold at a time when this province and the other provinces need Ottawa to be taking action.
How aligned do you think the premiers are on Trump's tariffs?
Well, uh, you know, uh, the interests are really different spread across the country. I think that's why you look to the national government on this.
Right.
But they had a conference call this week, the premiers did, and they've agreed to collectively go down to Washington, D.C. in February and meet with congressional leaders, senators, members of the House of Representatives down there, government officials, to make the case that a 25% tariff on goods coming into the United States from Canada, which is the threat, that's going to have a huge impact on Americans too. That the trade between the two countries is so integrated and so governed by a general approach of free and easy movement of goods. It's going to have an impact on the Americans, right? They're going to, I mean, we know because we've made the case over the years that lumber, that'll drive up the price of housing. There are American communities that depend on Canada for electricity in the East. There are American communities that depend on our oil and gas. Most of British Columbia's natural gas that's exported, all of it still goes to the United States. Same with oil. And they're going to go down there and make the case. The premier said, well, the premiers, the first ministers, are hoping that the national government will be there to help as well. And I think our diplomats and our officials will. The prime minister says he's prime minister until the day he hands it over to whoever wins the Liberal leadership. But as I said, Harold, it was really clear from the premier said that even though the BC NDP and the federal Liberals have had a good relationship, and that probably the federal Liberals would say the best relationship they've had with the province is the BC NDP led government in BC. In spite of that, when you got into the details, the premier was saying again and again, well, we're trying to figure out what this means. The prime minister stepped down, he prorogued parliament. We've run, and most media have run. There's a long list of legislation that's put on hold. British Columbia was looking for an understanding with Ottawa to extend childcare. There's no deal. British Columbia was asking Ottawa to waive the requirement that we have to raise our carbon tax on April the 1st. There's no deal. British Columbia was trying to get an understanding with the federal government that would allow the province to pay out the grocery rebate that the premier promised during the election. There's no deal. And while it's true there's still a federal government, I think the question that BC's asking is, will the federal government, will the bureaucrats in Ottawa be reluctant to agree to anything until they find out who the new leader is? Are you going to commit to a whole bunch of stuff only to have a new prime minister take over in March and have that? Well, we're not doing that. We're going to do something different. So it's a really bad time. And I think that's been reflected in all the coverage. I think it was reflected in the premier's press conference on Tuesday and David Eby's press conference on Tuesday, even though he tried to be nice about the departing prime minister.
Well, might the next prime minister be a former BC premier?
Yeah, the premier provided us with an entree into that. David Eby got asked about the possibility that Christy Clark getting ready to run for the federal Liberal leadership. And Eby said, well, he and the former premier of BC have had their differences. I mean, they ran against each other in Vancouver Point Grey in a by-election, and Clark won, and they had a rematch in Vancouver Point Grey in the general election in 2013, and David Eby won the seat. So yes, they've had their differences, but the premier said, look, you got to say that it would be a good thing for British Columbia if a candidate from British Columbia were seeking the leadership of the national government, because that person will be bringing up issues of importance to British Columbia and providing a BC perspective on things. And so the premier said he thought it would be a good thing if Christy Clark's going to run. Didn't endorse her, but I think he's right about that. British Columbia has trouble getting attention on the national stage. We feel like, all the attention nationally is on Ontario and Quebec. And so, yes, the premier said he thinks Christy Clark running would be a good thing. And I think, like most of us, his reading of the situation is that she's on the verge of announcing that she is going to go for the top job. Whether it'll be today or very soon, her organizers have said, well, they're waiting to see what the rules are for the leadership. Well, those were announced yesterday. So I think we're probably on the verge of an announcement that Christy Clark's going to go for the big job nationally.
Now, of course, she was a BC Liberal premier, but there's a bit of distance between the old BC Liberals and the federal Liberals. Does she have federal Liberal bona fides?
Yeah, I think she does. She grew up in a Liberal household. Her dad ran for the federal party back when the provincial party and the federal party were united. They're separated now, but they used to be the same party. So no, she says, she's been a Liberal, but her opponents are already circulating something else, which is when she became the BC Liberal Premier of British Columbia way back in 2011, that party is not the same as the federal Liberal Party. It's a separate party, but it also has a lot of people in it who are conservatives federally. So Clark had to reassemble that coalition. She was a Liberal, so she did a whole bunch of events in 2011 with conservatives. You may remember Stephen Harper came out and went to a hockey game with Christy Clark. Jay Hill, Stockwell Day, Preston Manning. She did all of that to establish that she respected both halves of the BC Liberal Party out here. Well, as you might imagine, some of her opponents are circulating pictures of her cozying up to Stephen Harper to say, is she really a Liberal? Well, I think the best argument Clark has going for herself is that she took over here in 2011 from Gordon Campbell, and she brought a very different style of governing to government in BC, and she won the election. I think the different style is one of the things that did it. When a party is in trouble politically and the leader leaves, it's a good idea to pick somebody different. People are already sniping at her and saying, well, her French is not all that good. And I'm not able to judge that question because my French isn't all that good either. So I don't know. But that's, it'll be a battle. Look, I think you also go, somebody like Christy Clark's been in politics a long time. She's pretty shrewd. She's running for position in the long run. She may be well aware herself that she doesn't have, a great chance of winning this time, but she may reinstitute herself into federal politics. And in the long run, we might see her as a cabinet minister in the future. We might see her as a future leader of the BC, of the federal Liberal Party.
If the federal Liberals can win any seats in BC in the next election, I guess will be the question.
Harold, the history of BC leaders of national parties is not great. Kim Campbell took over in 1993. She lost her own seat. Federal Conservatives were reduced to 2 seats. John Turner led the party from British Columbia. He did a little better, but he still lost the election. In fact, he lost 2 elections. So, we don't have a long history of commanding respect on the national stage. Justin Trudeau was from here and lived here, and his mother was from here, and his grandfather was a federal cabinet minister. But when he decided to get a seat in Parliament, he went for one back east. He didn't go for one here in British Columbia.
Right. Interesting. Well, we should talk about what came out late in the week, and that's the Conservative candidate in Surrey Guildford challenging the outcome, the very narrow victory. The NDP won that seat by 22 votes.
Yeah, so it was the closest election, really, and certainly in modern times in BC. And the New Democrats hung on to their majority by 1 seat. And you're right, they won that seat in Surrey by 22 votes on a recount. So the Conservatives came out, had a news conference in the Capitol on Thursday of this week, and gave us a bunch of documents and reports and letters. And they say they've found 45 votes that were cast in Surrey Guildford that they say are problematic. So they say 1 person voted twice, so that's 2 votes. They say 22 people voted and their vote was counted in Surrey Guildford. They lived somewhere else and the votes should have been counted there. And they say there's 21 ballots that were cast by mail from a home in Surrey Guildford for people with substance abuse issues. And they say those votes didn't need to be cast by mail because there was a polling station right across the street. And they produced affidavits, 2 of them, where people said they didn't ask for a ballot by mail. It was pushed in front of them and they felt pressured to cast a ballot. So, they're secret ballots, right? We don't know how those 45 votes were cast, but the way the law works in BC, if you can persuade, if you can show that the margin of problematic ballots exceeds the margin of victory, then there are grounds to overturn the result. It doesn't mean the result will be overturned, but if you can prove it, you've got a case for overturning the result. And what that means is a court would declare the result of the seat vacant, and there'd have to be a by-election. So we're now several steps down the road in talking about this, Harold, but that's the implications of what the Conservatives are doing. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean they'll win. It doesn't mean the win by Gary Begg, who is, took the oath of office, declared the winner. He's in cabinet. Doesn't mean he's out. It's just that's where all this could lead if the Conservatives have the evidence on their side. And what we saw this week isn't proof. It's evidence. There might be something there worth investigating.
Okay. So now it's up to the courts in this case.
Yeah, there's actually, it's a 2-pronged thing they've done here, Harold. They took all this evidence and they gave it to Elections BC, and they've asked the chief electoral officer to look into it. And the chief electoral officer has confirmed to us that, they received the complaint and they are looking into it, but obviously they're not drawing any conclusions. So the chief electoral officer Anton Bogman. He's an independent officer. If he were to see a serious problem here, he would have the option of taking the thing to court himself. The losing candidate there, a conservative, is saying he's going to go to court himself. He's going to take all this and lay it in front of a judge, BC Supreme Court. And again, if he can persuade the court could invalidate the result of the election, and that would mean another by-election. But I would say, the thing that I thought was quite interesting was we get into this news conference, and John Rustad, the leader of the Conservatives, is there. And he discloses that the Conservative Party executive have decided not to financially support the court challenge. And I sort of went, if you thought you had a really good case, wouldn't you be in there fighting with all your resources? I asked Rustad that question and he kind of sidestepped it. So I would say, there's a question mark over how good their evidence is. And we'll wait to see what Elections BC does. And we'll wait as well to see if a court takes this up. As I say, we're still a few steps from this overturning that one seat. I think it's also important to point out that even if that seat were overturned, the New Democrats have an agreement with the Greens, where the Greens have agreed to support the NDP when it matters, to keep the government from falling, to allow the government to pass its budgets and throne speech. So again, you do the math, there are 44 Conservatives in the legislature, 47 NDP, 2 Green. Okay, so again, let's suppose for a moment that the court does declare that one seat vacant. The government has 46 seats, 1 vacancy, but they've got the support of the 2 Greens. So they've still got 48 votes when they need it, and the Conservatives only have 44. So as I said, it's important, but it's also the kind of thing where you're looking down the road and saying, if the Conservatives managed to plant the idea with some people that there were some problems with that election, well, that's the sort of thing that may play out over time, even if it doesn't result in a court decision or a decision to reverse that one seat.
I see. All right. Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Thank you, Vaughn. Appreciate your time this week.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.